Hi, my name is Jay Weaver, and this is my overview of my SRIP experience in RFIS. So the technology I'm researching is corona wind, and essentially, for example, when lightning strikes, you're having a very, very high electric field, and corona wind occurs just below that electric field. Now, essentially, what's happening is atoms are being ionized, which means that valence electrons are being pulled off of atoms. So, for example, in this picture here, where this corona is, you could imagine that is a emitter electrode, which is an electrode that I'm using. Essentially, it has such a high positive voltage. It's so high, in fact, that negative electrons of neighboring atoms are being ripped off of their valence shells and giving them a net charge. So previously neutral atoms will now become positively charged. So not only will they be repelled by this corona over here, which is an electrode, they will also be attracted to the airflow area, which would be my counter electrode. Now, this technology is used quite often in space, and it's also used in, for example, computer cooling and various other technologies. So, a little bit more in depth, like I said before, this is happening just below the breakdown voltage of air, and the breakdown voltage of air is 3 million volts a meter. So, this is just happening just below that. Additionally, the onset electric field is actually proportional to various factors such as the environmental conditions. So over here you can see that this delta, that's actually an environmental factor, which is equal to 1 at 25 Celsius and 1 atmosphere, however that can change depending on those factors. It's also proportional to E naught here, which is the dielectric strength of air, so that's that 3 million volts a meter we have over here. K is a roughness factor, which is actually really unmeasurable for me, but I can just assume that it's going to be 0.308. And this radius is the radius of a wire. Now, my system is not quite exactly the same as this, but you can imagine that it's similar to that. Additionally, at the top here, you can see that this is how voltage is related to the electric field. So you can see that voltage is increasing, is going to decrease with smaller radiuses of wires, which basically means that sharper wires will need less voltage to cause corona onset. And additionally, they will increase with an increase in distance. So if those electrodes or that distance is increasing, you'll require more voltage to achieve onset. So here's why fields are magnified at the tips of electrodes. So for example, if you have a sphere with excess charge, meaning there's just excess electrons in that sphere, they will actually balance out perfectly. So, for example, in this picture here, you can see that you could imagine these positive ions right here are all just excess charge. And you can see that they will actually equal themselves out at the surface of that sphere. So, with any sphere, if you have excess charge, it'll spread evenly along the surface. However, with sharp tips, for them to be able to even out their electric field, basically, they will have increased charge. To even out their charge and electric field, I guess to even out their electric field, they will have increased charge at these radiuses, at these areas of higher curvature. So, for example, in this needle, I haven't measured this exactly, but this should be around 20 micrometers. So that's pretty sharp, and that means that using this sharper needle, you will have a higher electric field when a voltage is applied. So for my setup, you can see here I'm using a high voltage power supply, which is this gray box over here. Additionally, I'm using some other equipment, which I'll get into in more depth in a second. Additionally, for a lot of these photographs, like in the very first slide, I've used a camera in a dark room. So the room that is actually filming in here, when all the lights are turned off, it is pitch black. So we can get some nice long exposure photographs. So the first setup I had was needle. However, this did not work due to imbalanced electric fields. The second configuration I did was actually asymmetric, which is good. So it had a flat copper electrode with a needle. And this, as you can see at the bottom, was the first setup where I actually was able to get some plasma flowing. And this was able to be done around 2 kilovolts at a small gap distance of about 1 millimeter. Again, and additionally, this corona was sustained, meaning that this was sustained, meaning that this could run for hours. So once that success occurred, I started measuring current, because previously I was just measuring the onset corona being when I could see it like visually. Even in the darkroom, it could be difficult to see as it was so dim. So using a picoammeter, I was able to measure the current. And the circuitry is a little bit complicated, but I was basically attached to a virtual ground, as the ammeter I was using had a maximum voltage of 50 volts for some ranges, and I was using upwards of up to 6,000 volts. So I made a virtual ground, so it was essentially 0 volts. So the next step, which I've only tested and it has not worked so far, but that is measuring the thrust off of this. So as I mentioned before, with the needle and you have these charged particles, there's going to be a force of these charged particles in space are going to cause a force against that needle. So it might be difficult to see, but this little copper plate here is where that needle is. So any ions in space will be pushing down on that, which will push down on the scale, which will give us a reading. Additionally, you could have a scale that is basically on the other side of that, so the collision's running into the top, where this black area is right here. However, that's a little bit, the physics of that gets a little bit more complicated, and it would not be as accurate. But yeah, this has not worked because the resolution of my scale is too low. It's only 0.1 gram resolution, so the thrust I'm making is so small, it's insignificant. So I've gotten some preliminary results here, so you can see that around 1.25 kilovolts is when I first really saw that jump of about 100x here, and that is when, seemingly when this current's increasing, that is when corona is onsetting. That's pretty much all my presentation, so I'd like to thank the Burroughs Wellcome Fund, the NCSM Foundation, the Physics Department, Dr. Falvo, and all of my fellow research and physics members. Thank you so much.